Now, before I get into my review for Solo, let me warn you that there may be very minor spoilers for the movie in this video, so if you don't want to know absolutely anything, click away now and watch this another time. Also, let me just very quickly give you a rundown on what I thought of the previous 3 Star Wars movies under Disney. And I do this so you understand the standpoint this review is coming from, because for better or worse, people are likely going to have a lot of bias one way or the other going into this movie, and fair and honest reviews from fans are not going to be easy to come by. You'll of course have those who hated The Last Jedi and now want all things Star Wars to fail in the hopes that Kathleen Kennedy, current president of Lucasfilm, will get fired, and most of those people are going to pan the movie no matter what they may have really thought about it. While on the flip side, most of those who have staunchly defended The Last Jedi might be prone to give a glowing review of Solo simply because they won't want to give an inch in their continuing efforts to defend Episode 8 and Disney Star Wars. Anyway, as for what I personally thought of the previous 3 Disney Star Wars movies, I liked The Force Awakens for the most part. I have some issues with it, sure, but I understand the movie was what it needed to be. It welcomed fans back to the franchise, and in particular, those who probably hadn't thought much about Star Wars since the prequels had ended. In other words, it was the movie it had to be, and I'm fine with that and even enjoy it for the most part. Rogue One I thought was great, and the best of the first 3 Disney Star Wars films. Again, it wasn't without its flaws, but it felt like Star Wars to me, and it told an epic story, and it did it with mostly new characters, which is impressive. The Last Jedi, however, well, I can't find much good to say about that movie. I just don't get any enjoyment out of it. I could go on and say more, but I've made plenty of videos going into all the reasons that movie didn't work for me, and you're free to check those out if you'd like. As for Solo now, well, I went into this movie with low expectations, and quite a few fears, mainly if this would destroy the character of Han Solo and about Alden Ehrenreich's, who of course plays the young Han, ability to pull this off. Nevertheless, I still had hope, and I didn't want to let the bad tastes left in my mouth by The Last Jedi affect what I thought of this movie. I was hellbent on watching Solo just as its own thing, and giving it a fair chance. After all, it deserves that much. But after the first 30 minutes or so, I really had my doubts about this movie. And I wouldn't say that's because it starts out slow. There's actually quite a bit of action in the first quarter of the movie. Almost too much when maybe there should have been a bit more character building. But the real problems were, it just felt disorganized and messy from the start, if you will. And everything is just so dark. And I don't mean in terms of the tone of the movie, but rather the actual lighting of the movie. A lot of the shots are so dark that it's hard to make out what's going on. And I wonder if this was done to cut some corners and save a bit of money because, as you likely know, most of this movie had to be reshot when Lord and Miller were fired and Ron Howard took over as director, which means this movie cost a lot more to make than they wanted it to, and the temptation to take some shortcuts had to be there, no doubt. Then again, I suppose there's also every chance this darkness is very much intentional, and there to help give a feeling of the shadow the Empire casts over the galaxy and over Han's life as well. Because later on, once the movie and Han move away a bit from the oppression of the Empire, the movie does lighten up somewhat and gets a bit brighter and more colorful, though always kind of remains dreary looking, which I don't have a problem with because it does give that lived-in universe look, which is one of the many things that made the original Star Wars movie unique and different. As the movie goes on, then, it does start to find its footing, and it gets much better and begins to tell an actual story, though that story never grows to what most would consider a Star Wars scale story. There are some interesting and, in my opinion, somewhat successful and appreciated attempts to give this movie some relevance to the bigger picture, and even to tie it into the other sources of canon within the Star Wars universe. But I never found myself all that invested in the plot till pretty much the bitter end, when said plot was coming to a conclusion. And the main reason for that is, with this being a type of prequel, you know certain characters, like Han and Chewie, are not going to die, which automatically takes a good deal of the tension away. And speaking of Han and Chewie, the interactions between these two were fantastic, and some of, if not most of, the best parts of the movie were moments between just them. And I'm happy to say that, for the first time in a Star Wars movie, Chewie really got a chance to shine and feel like a main character, which is even more appreciated after he got relegated to doing little more than playing with porgs in The Last Jedi. As for Alden Ehrenreich's performance as Han, though he's no Harrison Ford, and my brain, after having seen the original Star Wars movies too many times to count, has a problem believing that he is Han Solo, I think he did a fine job, as about as good as can be expected out of anyone considering he was playing one of the most iconic characters in the history of Star Wars, if not the history of film. And to be honest, I was ready to be very, very critical of his performance, but I don't have much bad to say about it. The key here, and many of you tried to tell me this, but I didn't want to listen, is that he's not playing the same Han Solo as Harrison Ford did. And what I mean by that is, this is Han before he becomes the jaded guy we meet in A New Hope. Hell, this movie is what starts to turn him into the jaded guy we meet in that cantina on Tatooine some 10 years in the timeline after this movie. And my biggest fear going into this movie was that they'd ruin Han, that they'd show he had a heart of gold all along. And though I don't want to touch more on this and risk spoiling anything for you, I think they did a good job of showing us what a young Han Solo would truly be like. And even though my brain has trouble processing that Alden is the real Han, it accepts that this is what his story would be like, if that makes sense. As for Donald Glover's Lando, the same thing applies. No one else is Billy D. Williams. No one. Donald Glover does have a smoothness and a charisma about him similar to Billy D., and it works about as well as can be expected or hoped for. But personally, my brain again has trouble accepting that they are the same character, even though I do think it was a great performance, and like with Han, I buy that this is what he'd be like at this time in his life. Then there's all the new characters, and most of them are really good and well played. Hell, the strength of this movie is in the characters, not so much in the story itself. Woody Harrelson's Beckett was probably the standout in my opinion, but I was also impressed with Emilia Clarke in here as well. While the droid L3 was probably the low spot for me, and I know some out there will hate her because, well, they'll see her as the social justice warrior robot because she calls for equal rights for droids throughout the movie. But this actually tied into the plot of the movie in an important way, so personally, I don't have a problem with it. Does it feel a bit strange? Sure. But at least there's also a reason given as to why Lando doesn't just wipe her memory. The last thing I want to talk about here then is the fan service in this movie, and just like with Rogue One, there are a lot of subtle moments that will go right over the heads of a lot of viewers but will be noticed by those more familiar with the ins and outs of the franchise. And I know some people don't like these type of moments, but I personally really do enjoy them. They make the universe feel tied together, especially when those references are to characters or events that originated outside the movies. The Ghost being at the Battle of Scarif in Rogue One is an example of this, as is Chopper being seen at Yavin Base and the name General Syndulla being heard. And although Solo isn't the movie I wanted or would have ever asked for, to be honest, it worked because I felt something in it that I didn't feel in The Last Jedi, and that's a care and concern for the fans. I've said before, and I'm not changing my tune now, that Disney and Lucasfilm likely decided to make a Solo anthology movie because it felt like a safe bet to them, a good way to assure themselves a hit that would make a lot of money because they thought, and maybe wrongly, that Han Solo is a favorite and all us fans will of course want to see what his early adventures were like, even though that's the last thing a lot of us fans wanted. Nevertheless, this likely mindset, or believing they were making a movie that fans were really going to appreciate and enjoy, has resulted in a movie that, yeah, it still has a good deal of flaws, much like The Last Jedi, but one that I enjoyed much more than The Last Jedi, and I'm far more forgiving of because I felt an intent to make a movie for us, for the fans. It's like with Infinity War. There are plenty of flaws there to pick at if you want to, but I felt like the movie was made for fans, so I forgive those flaws and overlook them. Whereas with The Last Jedi, I don't feel like there was a concern for how the fans would feel or react, and the real strange part of all this is how excited I was to see what became of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, and then I left the theater disappointed and not really wanting to see more. Yet with Solo, a part of me didn't want to see this movie, didn't want to see or know more about the young Han Solo and perhaps have his character ruined. Yet in this case, I left the theater happy, and even open to seeing more. And I can't help but think that's because of the approach taken by two very different directors, Ron Howard and Rian Johnson, of course. Whereas one seemed concerned about telling the story he wanted, that being Rian Johnson with The Last Jedi, the other, Ron Howard, was no doubt very concerned about the story he was telling and how fans would react to it. And I know some of you will take to the comments below and talk about artistic freedom and that catering to the fans is going to lead to boring stories or what have you. And I don't want to get too deep into this topic here because this is meant as a quick spoiler-free review of Solo. But I wanted to at the very least try and articulate why I liked one flawed movie, that being Solo, and didn't like another, that being The Last Jedi. And yes, there are different levels and different types of flaws in these two movies. But the key is, after a rough start, I really enjoyed Solo, and thought it was a fun movie with good, interesting characters, and I appreciated the concern for the fans that was clearly shown within it. Whereas with The Last Jedi, I couldn't get into Rian Johnson's approach, that all that matters is the story he wanted to tell, and not the fans who paid good money to see it and have been following this franchise for 40 years. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. I will certainly be talking a lot more about Solo in future videos to come, but I wanted to get this general, non-spoiler review up and would appreciate if people avoided leaving spoilers in the comments below. Nevertheless, do tell me what you thought about this movie, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.